Hi, Gregg Perry, the historic preservationist. Um, Welcome to the episode of America's 250th anniversary edition. And as we said, we're continuing with the New Jersey's oldest colonial tavern and taverns in general from the colonial era. Good information to kind of put your mind into possibly where these people were when they landed here. Um, Today it's going to be traveling road travel, but traveling in the early colonies through, or even trying to reach New Jersey's oldest colonial tavern. Well, we have to think about it when John Chivers was sent over here by King William back in around 1650. They had someone come over and they charted the Salem Creek out, and they came up the Salem Creek. And just think about it, they had to guesstimate where to stop. Um, Looking for some solid ground to leave Salem. Salem was a lot of marshland at that point. So just imagine you're coming in a 40-foot, 50-foot boat, sailboat, and you need to get onto land. Well, there's marsh on both sides of the river. Just imagine this muck that you typically see, when you go down the shore, you see the marshlands. Literally, if you step in it, you'll go knee deep. Um, so imagine getting 40 men, their provisions, some axes and some saws and all that. Just to do that would take a few days. Imagine. And how do you tie the boat up initially? So none of this stuff was easy. So when they first came up the Salem River, they're looking for number one, a place that they could build a warehouse and a wharf or two. They actually built two wharves, would accommodate two typical sailing vessels of the day. And then they wanted to be close enough to hardened topsoil, hardened land that they could create a road and put the first tavern at. So, and remember that there were so many trees, and they were old growth trees. These trees would have been easily 48, 42 plus inch diameter, up until 60 inch, with old growth forest. And as soon as you broke the perimeter of the marshes, the muck, you probably had about 10 feet, and then you were into heavy trees, heavily wooded area, thickets, briars, difficult terrain. Um, so upon first landing, the first year and a half to 2 years was clearing an area, putting up a warehouse for future ships coming in, for supplies, expeditionists coming in later on, the next year, later that year, etc., and putting up the docks. But you had to cut down the trees. You had to cut down trees and create logs to build the warehouse, to build the piers and the tie-ups for the boats. So just imagine. So what they did, they uh, they got involved with the Lenni Lenape Indians. They they were peaceful with them, and they bartered with them for various English goods, for help in deforesting and creating logs and building these buildings. And the first year, they lost 10 to 12 of their 40 individuals to disease and famine. And they ended up with, after the second year, about 20 plus the Native Americans. So the first tavern was going to be 8 to 8.5 miles away. And that was signified by where does your horse run out of gas, essentially. And that puts coming into Salem, the port of Salem, where the Royal Port Antiques is in Salem today, to Woodstown, New Jersey, where routes 45 and 40 intersect. That's about 8.25 miles from the warehouse, the wharf that the boats and the men landed in. It took 6 to 6.5 years to totally deforest about 8.5 miles of trek. And a trek back then would have been the capability of getting two carriages side by side, such as a typical secondary roadway today. But it wasn't the same. The width equivalent would have been that of one lane on a secondary road, would have accommodated two carriages. But nevertheless, when you're cutting down trees, 36, 40, 48, 50-inch diameter trunks, 120 feet high. And then you're going to burn the stumps out. 8.5 miles. They worked round the year. It took about 6 years to do the entire road. And then come up and have people collecting, small stones in the fields, which there weren't many fields, and that made it even more difficult. So going into the forest and collecting stones, pails of stones, um, probably leather pails at that. That's the kind of pails they were using, and throwing them over the roadway. Um, so how difficult was that? And even the travel. Just let's contemplate the travel. So traveling in the winter could be exponentially treacherous. You're on dirt, you're on a bit shaky ground, and you have snow. Imagine going into the spring when you have a snow thaw like we just had in the Northeast, and then rain on top of that. And the wheels of the carriage were sometimes 2 to 3 inches wide and made out of with a metal liner on the outside. They would sink deep into mud, sometimes 6, 8, 12, 15 inches. And you would actually have to shift your cargo on your carriage if it was an unmanned, shift it to the one side if the other side was sinking in, or if you were carrying individuals, if it was like a taxi or a carriage, just taking people from the wharf up to the first tavern. People may have to get off, they may have to shift over. This could happen 3, 4, 5 times every mile in the spring when it's very wet. And here's to say that you don't run across some Native Americans that were not so happy to see you, and there could be other issues like that. But just the travel. Now imagine well, the time we're talking is the late 17th century, and there were provisions in the first warehouse, although it wasn't a tavern to sleep. They made people were sleeping on the floors with burlap type blankets, and but just imagine that the carriage was ready to head out to, say, Woodstown, the first tavern. There's no alarm clock. Who wakes up and said it's 5 o'clock, it's 7 o'clock, it's 8 o'clock? It's by the luck of the draw. Watches didn't come to the common individual probably until the 1720s, 1710. And then again, you would have had to have a ton of money. Um, would the King of England have provided them? Possibly, but not in the beginning, no. So, your driver may wake up, or the person that's running the carriage up may wake up at 5 one day and 8 the next. Then he's got to wake everybody else up and get everybody out and into the carriage and down the road. So travel was extremely difficult. There were no time schedules to adhere to. And if you got caught up by pulling the carriage out of ruts, and imagine your horse may not be able to make even the 8.5, 8.25 miles. So you may have to have another rider or runner take one horse, go and get a fresh horse, and come down and pick you up where you are. So it was wrought with challenges, to say the least, and even rain, because they didn't have tarpaulins, they didn't have tarps in general. If it was something semi-perishable or something that would rust, it was going to follow out of degradation. Or if you had individuals on the back of this carriage coming into the port of Salem, which thousands and thousands of people did over a 30-year decade, 3 decades, around 30 some years. So bad days were not good days to travel. These were open, almost like pickup trucks, but in a carriage form with one horse. And back to thinking, I mean, cutting a tree down was one thing, and then taking the manpower to manipulate the main trunks, the part it was cut down in, and get them out of the road, and maybe using some of that wood to help start the fire to burn the stump. But yet that timber was green, so it wasn't going to burn well. Um, but so traveling and setting up the first roads were just not easy. And when they got to the tavern, the first tavern in Woodstown, for example, such as the Sign of the Key, or this could have been anywhere in England for that matter, you're either going to take a room for the evening, you're going to get a meal, have a drink, and then move on the next day, or you're going to trade your horse in for a fresh horse. You actually just leave your horse there, you take the next horse. If you leave the horse there, The innkeeper had somebody working in the stable to feed your horse, wipe your horse down, take care of your horse. Farrier would have been there to shoe your horse if needed to be. So that's how these things would have been taken care of. And payment for the trip, payment for the horse care, payment for the tavern. A lot of times is barter. So 50, 60% barter, currency. What is the innkeeper going to do with cash? What is he going to do with money, coins? There's nowhere he can spend it either. So it was a very difficult time. But anyway, that's part one, going into early travel life in the early colonial taverns, celebrating our 250th anniversary of America's anniversary. Gregg Perry, the historic preservationist, signing off. And don't forget, for those who like to listen to podcasts of any and everything about history, look us up on Apple Podcast, the purple button, Spotify, and two YouTube channels, The Historic Preservationist, and Historic Preservationist. Gregg Perry signing off. Thanks all for viewing.